Necessities, simple bare necessities, simple bare necessities of life. Ba-dum. How you doing? Greetings and salutations. You know, anytime I do one of these videos, I've only got like about 4 lines of notes here. It's not like I'm saying everything in a video based upon what's on the screen. I only have a few lines on here. Everything is up here between my ears, yeah? Up here in that squishy jello section. Try to keep things really simple. And sometimes I get shocked at the fact that I keep things so simple. And yet, sometimes people still don't understand it. It's like, wow, made it simple, but it needs to be more simple. The simple fact is that I grew up, learning and discerning these things naturally, either through osmosis from information, but mostly through natural intuition. I actually have an extremely strong sense of intuition, and there's 2 different types of intuition. Of course, there's simplex conscious intuition, and there's something that is a transcendent intuition, where you fundamentally, like you get the creeps about somebody, like you know nothing about them, including their name, but you got the creeps about them. And your intuition, of course, is completely accurate. More men actually need to use intuition. A lot of women say that they go off their intuition. Oh, you don't hear that anymore. But we do have a natural intuition. Like children kind of intuitively know whether something is natural order, whether it's right or wrong, even though they've not been taught one way or another about something. It's a pretty good example. Trying to make a simple discernment between empirical knowledge, i.e. episteme, what is commonly called intellect, and that of wisdom. Of course, these are 2 superficial words in the English language, obviously so, and we both think they're centered between our ears, but they're not. Intellect goes no further than the psychophysical. I like to use the radio analogy, because radio analogy is mostly accurate. It's actually the best analogy anybody's ever come up with. You're welcome. You're welcome. You can't take it too far, but it's about 98% accurate, and there's no other analogy that comes closer to that. Because water, of course, is the antenna for the manifestation of life, and life is the consubstantiality of 2 things, matter and spirit, yes? And water is the antenna for the manifestation of life. For without water, of course, we don't have life. Water is the dipole antenna for the manifestation of consciousness. I think part of the reason why people are so psychotic and nuts these days is that everybody's consuming diet soda and everything on earth other than water. Human body is supposed to actually consume water, and not like Mountain Dew, Code Red, and all these other horrible things, right? I've been known to consume some is about as equally bad, of course. It's the Gatorade stuff, just chemicals and sugar water, basically, but not recently. Anyway, the intellect is centered on the psychophysical body, the consciousness, and it is no different in the radio analogy of the broadcast, because the broadcast is not the signal. The broadcast, of course, is the interpolation of the signal by this radio. There's a lot of different stuff in it, not a whole lot, keep it really simple. Analog to digital converter, and of course it's the interpolation of that modulation. And of course the modulation is the frequency, but not the broadcast. The broadcast is the interpolation of that signal. If I could smash this radio to smithereens,
frequency mode. The pressure was 29.97 inches.
That's NOAA weather radio at 162.400 megahertz. If I smash this radio to smithereens, we can all agree, and it is 100% undeniable, that the signal remains. But remains where? Well, it's everywhere and nowhere. It is not localized. Yes? People talk about individuation. It's like, well, individual soul. Like, what is the discernment there? Have you ever taken a bubble bath and seen a single light reflected 1,000,000 times in 1,000,000 little miniature soap bubbles? So empirical consciousness goes no further than the radio. And of course the learning that we have in the episteme, someone's mind might be full of course, an endless shoestring of empirical facts. Be no different than the volatile RAM, the volatile memory that's in this radio. If I take the battery out for a certain time, there's another little battery in here, a little watch battery that actually stores the frequencies, the preset frequencies in this, and if that gives out, it's just a little flat watch battery, then everything is lost. Same thing is true of empirical knowledge, i.e. episteme. It's good to know a lot of stuff. And you'll say, what's your IQ? Like, that is the end-all, be-all. Memorization and regurgitation of facts, we don't need that now. We could just like Google it, right? What's the capital of Nebraska? Who cares? You know, these are supposed to be actually, this iPad and this iMac, they're supposed to be labor-saving devices. Like, you know, I don't want to piss my life away memorizing a trillion useless facts. It's good to know stuff. I'm not anti-intellectual at all. But these are supposed to be labor-saving devices, but all they've done is actually made life more complicated. That is 1,000% undeniable. There's nobody out there that is going to deny me on that fact. Anyway, the intellect and the empirical knowledge goes no further than the radio, analogous to the body. It goes no further than that. That's the consubstantiality between spirit and matter. There's another example of consubstantiality. Consubstantiality is nothing more than a fancy metaphysical term saying the product of two or more things. Now, this orange light that you see as I pass my flashlight through it, yeah, that orange light is the consubstantiality of two things. The body, i.e. the filter, and the light behind it, which would be analogous to the spirit. Yes? Right? Consubstantiality. The orange light is consubstantial. In other words, with the breakup of these two things, the separation of these two things, because the filter doesn't work anymore. This would be no different than old age, sickness, death, so on and so forth. Empirical knowledge is gone. The consubstantiality, i.e. the intellect, i.e. the episteme, the list of facts and things that we know, that things that we consider ourselves. Bob, Sue, Larry, he knows a lot of stuff. Sue knows a lot of stuff about cooking and gardening, and she's also a professor of English. It's all gone when these two things go their separate ways. This remains. This still remains in a certain form, eventually turns to dust, but the consubstantiality of these two things, yeah, the consciousness and the empirical facts, they're gone when these two things go their separate ways. Consubstantiality, once again, is nothing other than a fancy way of saying the product of two or more things, which of course is exactly what life is. So, while empirical knowledge is to be lauded, it is certainly not wisdom, nor are the two to be confused unless it is by an unintelligent person, i.e. a fool. Once again, in the radio analogy, the intellect will be the volatile RAM of the radio, which of course, when the radio goes kaput or you take the battery away for long enough, the information is wiped. As for the soul, i.e. the spiritus sanctum, there is a reciprocity between the radio and the signal, i.e. the empirical knowledge and the things that we feel and believe, and people could call this individuation, but analogously, it's nearly identical to what we would call upper sideband, lower sideband modulation of a frequency. Frequency, of course, is modulation in ABC, XYZ frequency, 100 megahertz, 100 gigahertz, the frequency and wavelength of that, but there is also two upper sideband and lower sideband modulation, so you could have 100 megahertz, for example, but also, too, in addition to that, you'd have upper sideband or lower sideband or single sideband modulation. I don't know if you know what single sideband modulation is, but you could look it up. It's not that complex. Superficially, I guess it might be complex. But there is a reciprocity between the persona non grata, i.e. Bob, Sue, Larry, how they feel, their likes and dislikes at the breakup of life, which of course is the consubstantiality of matter and spirit, the filter and the flashlight, for example. So, just like upper sideband and lower sideband information. This actually jives with countless things we actually see in nature as far as disembodied beings. I like to use the word disembodied being because it is way more accurate and far less stigmatized than the G-H-O-S-T word, which people, I don't believe in them. Well, who cares what you believe in? Let's just talk about facts. I don't believe in them. But doesn't matter what you or I believe. That's a matter for another thing. I'm going to keep talking about people thinking that they are their beliefs. Of course, wisdom is analogous ultimately to the soul, the proximity or lack of self-proximity to same. Wisdom seeks the self, and self-proximity is wisdom. Every branch of monistic metaphysics agrees on this, both Greek, Indian, and Egyptian. Wisdom culminates in absolute self-similarity. Yeah? Once again, using the old gold analogy. Gold is never, ever, ever purified, nor has gold ever been purified. Gold is gold is gold. The notion, the conceptual, the connotative implication of gold purification is extraction. You could say concentration. Well, how do we make something condensate out of something else? Yeah, how do we make water condensate out of the air? We're like, well, we know it's humid. We know there's water in the air. You ever, of course, been really cold outside? You're driving, you turn on your heater, your windshield. Outside of it's cold, inside of it gets hot. Water starts to condense on there. We have condensation. All of a sudden, things start to condensate out of the matrix or medium from which they're in. What is the opposite of wisdom? Let's just use the Greek word, it's gnosis. What's the opposite of gnosis? Agnosis, ignorance. Not terrestrial ignorance, talking about transcendent, i.e. primordial agnosis, the extrinsic attribute of the absolute. This is wherein which monistic monism, i.e. Advaita Vedanta, i.e. original Buddhism, i.e. the teachings of Plotinus, Proclus, Numenius, Plato, Pythagoras, on and on and on teach. There is no original sin, there is no prima causa. We're talking about the extrinsic attribute of the absolute, of which they called it Euristostaios. They also too called it Tolma. They also too called it the term Ananke. This primordial principle of illumination. Agnosis is no different than saying illumination. The nature of illumination is to become consubstantial with something else. Its attributional nature is to go forth and cling to something else. How would we tune? I've mentioned this many times before. Some people got it. One person actually humorously said that watching my video on this nearly killed him. I was like, how? Until I read further, because I read every comment. He said, the statement was so profound, he was chewing his food, and his brain was working so hard over time on the profundity of the statement that his brain forgot to tell his body to chew his steak before swallowing it, nearly choked on a steak. Well, don't have really deep thoughts while you're chewing your steak, I guess. Anyway, belief in existential selfhood, or the filter of light from wisdom, this primordial attributional nature of the first, i.e. the agathon, is agnosis. But it is not terrestrial or conventional, i.e. Existential ignorance. We're talking about transcendent ignorance, which of course really isn't ignorance, rather attributional nature of the principle. Wisdom, of course, or gnosis, is self-similarity. It is taking condensate out of that which is ever present. The signal is everywhere. Like right now, you meet everybody on Earth has a million, billion, literally, signals passing through us, both AM, FM, shortwave, ultraviolet, just endless. GPS satellites, they don't discern, the dishes on your house. They go down everywhere. Usually putting out between 5 and 10 watts of power. Think of the millions of different broadcasts that are being put out by Dish Network and I forget the other TV network. Just think of the endless, countless millions of frequencies that your body is being bombarded with every day. That's also a two-part of human insanity, is that all humans were poisoning ourselves, not only with what we eat and drink, but poisoning ourselves with frequencies. That without modulation, no radio on Earth, this is the thing the guy choked on, excuse me, no radio on Earth could pick up any signal without modulation. What would be self-similarity? It would be analogously perfect to the absence of modulation. This is actually mirrored, by the way, in the Nikayas. After the death of Gautama, Mara goes looking for Gautama and he can't find him anywhere. There's no modulation. There is nothing whereby which anyone or anything could find something that has modulation, i.e. attribution. With attribution, I can pick up 162.400 megahertz because it is being modulated at that frequency.
80%.
What would the definition of true energy be, i.e. fulfillment of wisdom, wherein which and by which there is no modulation? No radio could pick up a signal, which wouldn't be a signal by definition, without modulation. This primordial agnosis attribute, which is no different than saying transcendence, greater and greater transcendence, greater and greater self-similarity or self-reflexivity, wherein which and by which modulation, of course, vanishes. There's a huge difference between empirical knowledge and wisdom. They're not to be confused, even though a lot of people think that it's the same thing that's between two people's ears. Wisdom. They think like wisdom is some sort of conceptual abstraction of empirical knowledge, i.e. episteme, and that, of course, is not the case. No branch of metaphysics ever made that stupid statement, nor would they actually confuse the two. One is consubstantial with the body, and it goes no further than the body. No, it doesn't go any further than the body, even though there is a reciprocity there in the ignorant person at the time of death, wherein which a mirage of individuality does still remain. And this, of course, is the actual definition of hell, by the way. Wisdom is the signal being made self-similar. It is no different than that. Gold is never, ever purified. It is made self-similar. An analogous of gold in its matrix rock. Say we have an ounce of gold in this boulder here, right? You know, this imaginary boulder between my hands. That would be analogous to modulation. Well, there's a frequency of gold in this rock at 4 parts per million. 4 parts per million is no different than saying megahertz or gigahertz, whatever the frequency may be. The modulation of gold in this matrix rock is about 4 to 5 parts per million, which is actually quite a lot of gold. Gold mines extract at something not much more than that to make it profitable. You know, extract endless, like I think the average mine in South Africa is, what is it, 2 tons of ore to 1 troy ounce of gold, which is basically the size of this. 2 tons of rock to harvest this much gold. That would be saying the frequency at which gold occurs in this rock is 1 ounce per 2 tons, 2 metric tons. Yeah, that's the frequency, that's the modulation. Transcendence, i.e. wisdom, is no different than the self. It is self-proximity. So true, genuine transcendence would be, you know, an ounce of bullion grade 0.9999 pure 4 to 5 sixes, 4 to 5 nines, excuse me, pure bullion grade gold. Self-proximity, self-similarity, absence of dilution, absence of modulation. When there is modulation, there is ignorance present. The absence of modulation is wisdom. Wisdom is self-proximity. This is making simple the metaphysics of the ancients. At least I think this video made it really, really simple. If you disagree, then it really was very simple. What would a signal be without modulation? It wouldn't be a signal at all. It'd just be pure energy. And no radio on Earth could tune it. Yeah. There's a huge difference between empirical knowledge and wisdom. One is consubstantial, goes no further than death. The other one is not consubstantial, and it is self-similarity, self-proximity. I think I made that very simple in this video. I hope you liked this video. If you want to contact me or anything else, check out my description below. Lux Veritas. Goodbye.